but but that also means if something is unclear at any point, please stop me and let me know, because I understand. Um, my involvement with philosophy, I just wanted to tell you something, because I welcome a lot of you. Some of you are coming to philosophy, just now, or and also including a lot of the transfer students just coming to UCR. So welcome to all of you. I Because I'm from Italy and I went to high school in Italy, philosophy in Italy, in many of the high school, is a required subject. So as I actually studied, it's mostly history of philosophy. You study for about 3 years. So it's interesting because when you go to college, if you decide to major in philosophy, I would say maybe 95% of the students have already been exposed to quite a bit of philosophy. So they already know what they're getting into. And in Italian college, actually, you don't really have general education requirements. When you join the university, you already join a department as a major. It's just like, people don't really. So it's a very different experience. And I realized that the first time that I was asked to teach intro to philosophy, and I realized that I never took an intro to philosophy class because I did the philosophy in high school, and then as soon as I went to my college, it was already somewhat more advanced classes, and I was wondering myself, how am I going to teach intro to philosophy to students in college that have never taken philosophy before, because I never had that experience. So I'm still struggling with that, clearly. But I fell in love with philosophy early because of this exposure in high school, and I went on, and I said I never left the field. I'm still in school. Sometimes I joke with my family because they still talk to me as I'm still in school, like in high school, because to them I never left school. And they say, I'm a professor, so it's okay, but I don't mind. But sometimes I joke that they never saw me leaving school. They're still waiting for my graduation, I guess. And I'm also a first generation college kid. And so it just happens that I went to college, and then I went all the way to getting a PhD and becoming a professor. So I just want to, remind myself and you as well. I assume many of you, most of you are also first generation college kids. Let me tell you just also other things about what kind of philosophy I do. Actually, as part of my background, I have been exposed to a lot of philosophy across very different traditions. And one of the beauties of the department, the philosophy department UCR, unlike many other departments in the United States, is what is called a pluralist department, because we have professors and grad students that have interest across different traditions. Especially, there's a big divide in philosophy between what we call analytical or analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. And there's sometimes have been some wars, professional wars between the two camps, but not at UCR. One of the beauty of UCR that you can take classes in existentialism, let's say Heidegger or Hegel, and then do some of the contemporaries called analytic philosophy, and we all talk to each other. We all recognize the importance of philosophy as a discipline at large, and we don't divide, these subfields in the way that they do in other places. And that feels home to me because that's exactly how I learned doing philosophy in Italy in college, where, as I said, I could go from a class on the philosophy of quantum mechanics to Heidegger, one back to back. And I made some choices based on my interests or my capacities. I'm more of an analytic philosopher in that way, but it's not because I make a value judgment of the importance or the quality of the work. We have to specialize at some point. And then in terms of the philosophy that I do, my main interest is agency, our power, capacity to act. And more specifically, I've been doing work over the years about our capacity to act over time. So it's called diachronic agency. And so today I would like to talk a little bit about that. But that's kind of my main area of interest. Think about, having intentions for the futures, how you organize your activities over time, planning. These have been major topics of my research. And I've also done some research in some area of ethics or what we might call meta ethics. So not about specific ethical views, but some more foundational issues about the nature of normativity and morality. where I've tried to apply some lessons from the nature of agency and our power to act, what implications they might have for morality. But this is a somewhat abstract level. These are the main areas in which I've been working. And a little bit about personal identity. Personal identity is something that has been interesting me. And so some recent work, which I would like to present informally to you today, actually combines his interest on the nature of temporally extended agency, diachronic agency, and personal identity. Before I go on, I understand the meeting is until 5, is that correct?
Yeah, it technically ends at 5, as we had spoken before.
Right.
We can go a little bit longer.
Right, so,
and anyone's feel free to move in and out, turn your camera on and off whenever you feel the need to. It's very, very informal.
So yeah, so I said I'm available to stay after 5, so I'm happy to continue, but I'll try to, as I said, there's about 40 minutes. So my idea was that maybe I'll do, about 10 minutes of a little presentation and then have a little discussion for clarification issues and maybe do another portion. So I haven't really timed myself, so I'll be talking a little bit. I'll be looking at some notes, but I should be able to keep the Zoom going at the same time. At least I see you. So if you do anything in the chat and so on, probably I won't see that. So call my attention to that in case, while I'm keeping the other, my other notes up here. Okay. So, so what is the issue with thinking about our agency and time? Let's start with a very simple, actually, I'm getting a chat notification, so probably I'm getting them anyway. So feel free to write there if you have questions. Let's start with an observation that I hope is almost trivial, you would say. We are agents. We have this capacity to act, and we act over time. Our actions take time. We care about our actions over time. We just don't live and act in the present. Maybe we would like to spend more time in the present, but certainly doesn't seem to be the default condition for human beings. And as we think in these terms, we also notice that other beings in the universe, other agents, in particular other organisms and animals, to the extent that they act over time, it does look that they live and act over time in what potentially might be a different way. That's why sometimes you can read accounts and you say, oh, I would like to have a life of an animal, or that they seems to be able to enjoy the moment and live in the moment. And that's exactly one of the problems that I face in trying to think and organize about my own life, that somehow I have this other larger expanse of concern, worries, and I've kind of lost touch with this other way of living and acting. And essentially, this is actually, it's generally true in some sense. There's some truth to it, let's put this way. But what is exactly this difference, and what it is that might be distinctive then about human agency with respect to its temporality, to the fact that it takes time and it extends over time. And this has been a major concern of mine. And so in thinking about it recently, I was just trying to think about, well, okay, let's just try to get to the bottom of what it is to be even an agent that acts and live over time. Okay, we make this kind of statement, it seems to be trivial, but is it the end of the story when you simply say, yes, I persist, I exist over a longer period of time, and I act sometimes over longer period of times? Is this the end of the story? It turns out that in a way, it's easy to do what I call a negative characterization. It's easy to say, well, I just don't live in the moment. I just don't exist in the moment, although I might try to. But what it is in a positive sense, try to put more, more articulate description of this extending over time. And here is one of the ways that it helped me to think about it, as sometimes I do philosophy. Let's try to imagine some limiting cases. What would be actually for an agent to be an instantaneous agent? So something very different. So someone that really just exist in the moment. So, well, this is pretty simple. You can say, okay, take someone who's an agent, has a power. He can just do action in a particular moment. they only care about that moment. And let's imagine only they exist for a moment. So they just like act, care about what happened there, and they disappear. So in a way, you could say, notice these are not really, properly speaking, instantaneous in the sense that they don't have any extension at all. So I'm imagining they have a minimal extension. Whatever time it takes to make this simplest possible action, given their capacity, let's say that we call it the moment. And they just come into existence in the moment. They care about whatever happens in the moment. They act accordingly, and they disappear. Now, clearly, it seems like we are not like that. We are not like agents like that. And actually, it turns out, even when we think about organisms, animals, non-human animals living in the moment, we don't think that the animal just like pops into existence, act, cares only about the present, and disappears. So clearly, that's not the case. But it's a good as a starting point, because now you say, okay, this is what's going on. How are we different from what I call here pure momentary agents? And you can say, well, now there are different dimensions, right? I mentioned that. Notice, I mentioned their existence, the extent of their action, and the extent of what they can conceive and care about, right? And now you can start playing with these different dimensions. You can say, well, it looks like that we are different from the pure momentary agents in all of the three categories. We exist for longer in a moment, we conceive and care for longer in a moment, and we can act for longer than a moment, so, right? And then you say, well, is it possible to imagine then agents that only have one of these features and not the others, and what we can learn by comparing us to them? And so here is actually where I think it's interesting, and that's what it was helpful for me to try to think about this. Okay, let's start playing with the two dimensions, like, you have this different control. Let's imagine that we have agents now, that they exist longer. So they don't just come into existence and they disappear, but otherwise, like the momentary one, they only care about the present and they only act in the present. So that's already, so you can say, look, they exist over time, but they have this, their actions are always restricted to the moment. What do we say about their agency? Well, it turns out that you can say, in some sense, you can say, well, maybe they engage in longer activities. It turns out that their activities are always concentrating in a particular moment, but when you take one moment after the next, over time, these activities can build up. They look like extended, right? And it might turn out maybe some organisms are like that, right? So let's imagine, I have an example in the paper, I distributed like a pigeon. The pigeon exists over time, but you can imagine they only care maybe to, pecking some seeds in front of them. They act in a particular moment, they only care about that. And then you give them a series of these seeds and they keep doing it, down, 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 down. And then maybe 3 minutes later, you can say, well, the pigeon for 3 minutes have been feeding on the seeds. So it looks like that was 3 minutes. But notice that activity does not need to come together as extended because the animal has any sense of its extension. The animal might just be, here it is, here's food now, I'll get it. Oh, and there's food next, I'll do it. And they keep doing it for a while. That's extended, but it's nothing that concerns them in that way. Now, interesting enough, though, I say indirectly, it affects the pigeon as an extended organism because the pigeon feeds on that, and whatever they feed helps them live longer. So natural selection, for instance, can see, if you want, in the way in which selection can see this extended activity. They can benefit the agent as extended, but the agent itself does not need to see, understand, conceptualize, or care them in the longer term. Okay, so you see, just then giving you existing longer does not make you an extended agent in the fuller sense in which we seem to be extended. So that's one way. You just play with the ontological dimension of the existence. That's not sufficient. Now let's change. Let's imagine now we have agents that only exist for a moment, but they care about the future and they want to act into the future. So now these are agents that they say, look, okay, I just came into existence now. Let's imagine, they can realize that, and they care about the future. So they want to do something and affect the future, but they only have one chance, right? They have only one moment in which they can act. So now you can see, look, they act in that moment, they disappear after that. But what makes their actions to be about the future, given that they only get executed at a particular moment? Well, at this point, these agents, they need to have a capacity to conceptualize the effects of their actions. So even if the action is just in the moment, they can say, okay, now I press this lever, and then I see all the causal consequences. I can calculate them. And at the end, it gives me the result that I wanted now because I really care. I really care about something happening 3 years from now. And there is a mechanism, there's a machine here that has this effect. I can pull the lever, I'll die, I'll disappear, but I care what happened in 3 years. Maybe you have the solution to climate change. It's just a matter of pressing the button. I come into existence. Oh, where it is. There's a solution, press, happy, die, and later on that happens. Now, so now here we have, see the opposite is like the pigeon exists over time, but does not conceive or care about the future. And now we have something that comes into existence, care and concern about the future, but they all exist for a moment. And they just press the button and do that. It looks like that we are a combination of these two, right? You could say we exist over time, like the pigeon does, but we don't simply engage in this sequence of momentary activities, but we actually conceive of them and engage in them because of their longer term effects. So, okay, says, here it is, end of story. Not quite, I say, because there is still one element here. Our capacity, our power to act still suffers from a limitation of the following sort. There is no action at a temporal distance. Whatever I do, even if it's done in light of the future effects, has to be first done now. And I still have to rely on the future effects of my momentary action to have it extend over time. So even if I'm not like one of these agents that immediately dies, it looks like at a particular moment when I think about the future, I'm under the same restrictions as them. Because even if I want to do something that will have an effect 3 minutes or 3 years from now, what I do now can only indirectly affect what's going to happen in 3 minutes or in 3 years. So what I call this, there's a basic limitation in our executive capacities that applies even if in all other ways we are extended. We take us to live over time, we can conceive of the future, we can care about the future, but somehow we cannot immediately affect the future. And this is a problem that all temporary agents have. So in many ways, being a temporary agent is managing this restriction in our executive capacities. Of course, if you have the ability to conceive and organize and maybe rely on yourself into the future, that's the technique in which you can extend. But not that this is a key, it's an important moment here. It's not that I simply here say, okay, here's what I want to do in 3 minutes or in 3 years. I take my decision, done, end of the story. It turns out I have to figure out what's going to happen from now and 3 minutes or 3 years, and what else comes in between, and how much I can influence that. It turns out I cannot directly, immediately control it. That's exactly why there is no such thing as action at a distance. Now, and this is in a way is a restriction that we have to deal with, even with all of the other features extended over time. So when we look at all these dimensions, just to remind you, I said there was existence, conceptual capacity, cares. Okay, all of those things might go over time. I can exist longer. I can conceive for the longer term. I can care for the longer term, but I cannot immediately act for the longer term. I still need taking the steps moment to moment to get from here to the future. Let me add one more element. Now, of course, so in a way, someone could say, I am kind of like those momentary agents. I do something now, and then everything is in the hands of whoever or whatever is going to happen past the moment of direct control. So you can rely on causal effects, reliance on causality, and maybe it's reliable causal chains, so that's fine. Press a button. Maybe there are machines. There are reliable machines. Press the lever, and I expect that. Interesting enough, there are other agents also. Maybe I can rely on them doing some of the work. So maybe what I can do now, I can simply declare it's extremely important, it's essential that we solve the problem of climate change. And these are all the actions to be taken, and I lay them all out in 1 second. And then maybe that's the end of what I can do. Then I need someone else to pick it up the next moment, do whatever can be done at that moment, and then pass on the task to the next one. So here's one way that you can see, no matter what we do, even when you do it by yourself, you need to rely on me into the future being in that position of taking up that same project. And there is no guarantee, there is no metaphysical guarantee that that's going to happen, exactly because there's no action at a distance. So to say that I'm extended over time, that I conceive, care, and I exist over time is not yet the solution to the fact that I can act over time, if not, as I said, by the mediation of potentially my continuing to take up that project in the future. And that's part of me being a temporal agent. Maybe gods with some capacities, they could just act and get stuff done, either because they have infinite powers, and so it can just happen like that. They don't have to go through the steps, or maybe they exist outside of time. But if you're really a temporal agent, ultimately you need to struggle with this limitation on the extension of the executive capacities. There's always some indirectness about the amount of what you can control. So the genuine direct exercise of your agency, in that sense, seems always limited to the present moment. And this seems to be something that we need to deal with, right? Deal with. And so no matter how much you put onto the other level. So that's what somehow has been a constant concern of mine. How do you get that going, right? What are the ways of doing it? Before I continue, any questions right now? I'm happy to, given this framework, then I can tell you the kind of problems and potential solutions, but I'm interested in hearing if there are any questions.
Okay, so this is part of the thing that you said about the levels of, not levels, about our ability to do things, and we have to rely on other agents. So is there like a degree of agency? Like, for example, somebody say like a retail worker would have less agency than, say, the president of the United States. So is it like different levels of agency? Like the person with more power means that they're more of an agent, or is it just like a yes or no thing and we're all like on an equal level?
Good. Thanks, Andrew. Absolutely, there are different levels of agency. And let me tell you some of the dimensions in which you can see that. First of all, there are kinds of agency. So this is the case in which you could say, well, there is human agency, intentional, deliberate agency. Maybe there is agency by unicellular organism. I think that agency in that way, at least all living beings have some kind of agency, but clearly is of a different kind. So that's one dimension, right? But the one that you had in mind was different, was say, forget about animal organism and plants, but what about all human agents? To what extent there's different degrees of agency? Well, you could say, to the extent that we all exercise this basic power of being intentional agents, that's not the distinction. The distinction is more to the extent in which what is the range of conditions and circumstances that we can actually directly affect. That is a major difference. So if I put you in chains and I tie you to the chair or something, and let's say I put a tape over your mouth or something, maybe you have some amount of agency about, you can, maybe just try to move a little bit on the chair. That's as much as you can do as far as bodily agency is concerned. That's an extreme case, but it turns out you could imagine that condition of agency are affected in many other ways, such that exactly by not being given the physical conditions to exercise some amount of agency, or let's say the institutional or social powers to affect some of those effects. That in that way there are degrees. But what I'm imagining here, though, notice, is that in a way all agents, including those at the top of some social and political like hierarchy, are still limited in their capacity to act over time, in the sense that, just as a basic fact, not even the president of the United States or whatever it is cannot directly affect what he, she, or others are gonna do at temporal distance. It still needs to go through something. Now, it's true that if you are in some of this position, it might be easier for you to start whatever mechanism or whatever process will induce others or potentially yourself in the future, because that's to affect that. But it's not that all of a sudden I am more powerful, let's say, and I can overcome this metaphysical limitation. I think this is just a metaphysical limitation that affects everybody, any human being at all, right? Although, and I add one more element, if once you look at how much you can extend with how much reliable processing mechanism, institution, and so on, there is a different temporal horizon that might be available to some rather than others. So people under certain conditions, for example, of scarcity of resources, even if they attempt to indirectly affect their future, they might only have a limited temporal horizon that they can affect, and people in position of power or privilege actually have the possibility of potentially affecting the future for much longer time. That's absolutely in there. But they both have to overcome the basic barrier. They still have to do something that affects what happens in the future. I hope that was clear. So, okay.
I had a quick
Kevin?
question as well. Oh, sorry. Feel free.
Sure. No, you. I saw you coming.
I wonder what happens to this idea when you sort of expand or shrink time, like in our conception, because temporal agents, you could say, well, we act in, not just an instant, but from our perspective, that seems to be the case. But when you really zoom out a bit on like a larger time scale, it certainly seems as though we act on an instant. Or alternatively, if you kind of zoom in heavily, it seems as though you could kind of argue even someone, even the pigeon example that seems a lot more instantaneous could actually, zoomed in enough, seem as though it's a longer temporal agent, this loop. How does time sort of change this idea?
Right. Good. So in my view, that's what I'm using this notion of what I call the moment, right? And I don't give to the moment a definite temporal duration, because that, I think, it's ultimately related to certain kind of powers or capacity of specific agents that might vary with the scale. And so let me start with actual human beings. If I'm thinking about our sense of what might count as the moment over which we exercise this immediacy of control, this idea of immediate guidance or control, that's what is sometimes called the specious present. This is a terminology that comes from William James, and it's actually also something you find in Husserl. Husserl is one of the greatest philosopher about this particular experience of the present time. And this is sometimes called, it's like, it seems to be a stretch of time, maybe in the order of a few seconds, or that's kind of the order in which you're thinking about it. And I really want to think about phenomenologically about this, is to say, where is the time over which you make up your mind, but you don't change your mind? That's kind of my slogan now, my going on slogan. In a sense, and right now it seems to me now, okay, here's what I'm gonna do, and somehow I start doing it. If I can change my mind about it, that seems already a recognition in a way. That kind of change is the one that affects something that was already ongoing and somehow is going somehow into the past, right? So as I said, because this is just a phenomenological characterization, we have to do a little bit of this phenomenology. But clearly, if you tell me something that happens over 10 seconds, I already know I don't have immediate control over 10 seconds. I can start something now. This was less than 10 seconds, of course, right? You could already see that whatever, I don't have immediate control anymore of the stuff that I was trying to do. And certainly right now, when I said right now, I wasn't controlling what I'm doing right now. All right. So within that, so I'm saying, now, but it's a scale issue. So you could imagine other agents, and I don't know what their powers are, how they are built up and so on. They might, for what might count as a moment for them, might be shorter and potentially longer. That's why I don't give it something fixed, but I do a characterization of this that is fixed in a way for beings that have this kind of psychological capacities, and that they somehow exercise their power to make up their mind and initiate some of their activities. That is somehow the framework of the moment, because after that they know that if they continue doing something, they still have to continue by carrying it on, and at some point they realize there's things that they cannot undo anymore. That's really what the scale is. But let me add one other element. Now, of course, you notice, well, this stuff happened continuously. So yes, you tell me now I can only control what I'm saying now, and now I'm controlling what I'm saying now, right? But there seems to be some kind of continuity, and even experientially, it looks like I'm still engaged into that activity. So it's not that I'm completely detached from it, and I'm saying absolutely not. There is now also this ongoing sense of a flow of activity over which we notice the continuity. So even if it's true that what I just said 10 seconds ago, it's now in some sense in my past, I'm not completely separated and detached from it. That's exactly why I notice me as being continuous. But I still believe that even in that, even that this, in let's say the 10 seconds, now is going out of this kind of window of my control. And so what is interesting for us is to say, well, how far you can extend this? Because phenomenologically now, there's a species present, maybe there is a 10 seconds, but then you're talking about 10 minutes or 10 days and 10 months, and now it's starting to take a really different character, right? And that's really where you might notice that the effect of your control is really different in nature. So right now, it does seem to me that effectively I am in control of what I'm about to say in 10 seconds in a certain sense. But certainly if you tell me that I'm now in control on what I'm going to tell you in 10 minutes, that's not true. I mean, I might have a sense in which I might expect a sort of a continuity of this activity, that I might be doing something now that is constraining what I'm going to say in 10 minutes. That's all there. But let me tell you, I'm not right now determining immediately what I'm going to do in 10 minutes. You have to wait 10 minutes from now and see what's going to happen. And that is, so even as we change a little scale of what I call the present moment, that does not mean that I can extend it indefinitely. Because at some point, you're going to lose that immediacy, what I call the immediacy. Immediacy, notice here, doesn't mean instantaneously. It means that you don't have to take an extra step. So that's, you know, if you want to characterize phenomenologically, what it means is that right now as I'm speaking, I'm making up my mind and so on. This is the one step that I'm taking. If I have to take two steps, I make my mind and then I change my mind, it turns out that now what I'm changing, it already got some kind of fixity in the past. Maybe if I change it very quickly, it doesn't really matter, it doesn't have consequences, but it has to be done as a separate step. And if you think about the future, right now, finishing this sentence, it turns out that the second part of the sentence was not really commanded. It wasn't really fully immediately controlled at the beginning of the sentence. I had to complete it at the time that I was completing it. That's what I'm trying to get at as a basic experience of the moment, but with continuity. Is that clear? Or there's actually interesting work if you look at the rates even of just metabolism in organism, depending on scale. You'll notice it's like fascinating stuff exactly like that. So you might say there are some kind of laws of scale that people study. And so smaller animals have a much faster metabolism, and they might be processing even some information faster, like in a hummingbird as opposed to the elephant. And so if you had an elephant and an hummingbird or a whale to reach this level of conceptual sophistication by the temporal activity, it might well be that the present moment for a whale maybe lasts 10 seconds. I'm perfectly fine with that. And the hummingbird is like 1/10 of ours. But I would still say that once they've exhausted their capacity in what they can do, then they have to rely on indirect control. All temporal beings, no matter what. That was my idea. Any other questions?
I think I have a question.
Andrew, please.
I'm just trying to make sure I'm wording it correctly. So I'll try to do my best. So I couldn't help but notice that this issue of agency, being like temporal agents, might relate to or further clarifies how a practical identity can be established without by trying to say a practical identity isn't a constant, it's a process of an agent. Does that make sense? Is that
Good.
correct?
Yeah, actually,
And so,
Mhm.
I have to turn my camera off. My internet's
Okay.
unstable.
Yeah, sometimes you kind of, yeah. So you still want to complete that, or otherwise
Yeah. So I
I'll
just had to turn my camera off.
Yeah.
So it seems like the actions are occurring through the medium of time, and that is what is allowing for the practical identity to partially take shape. It's not, I don't want to try and say that you're saying this is all it is, but this is a substantial portion of having a practical identity, is accepting that it is not a perfect constant, and you don't know in 10 minutes,
Yeah,
right?
good.
And you're just reaffirming, over time, you're either reaffirming things or changing your mind.
Right. Absolutely. So you're just picking up on the next step of this, and for those of you familiar with existentialism, I have this existentialist very clear understanding of how then we extend over time and the nation of our identity. So the next step in the argument will be to say, okay, I get that we need somehow to sustain what we are doing from moment to moment, because effectively our executive powers don't, otherwise they get exhausted. And now someone could say, here's consider two options. One is to say, okay, at the moment I do something and then I just rely on whatever happens next. And maybe now someone says, well, maybe there are other agents and maybe me later will be there continuing it. And for some, that's at the end of the story. They say, fine, look, in many cases, you're still there, you'll go on. It's because your identity is exactly what you're relying on to take on and continue the project. And in a way, I could say, look, yeah, it kind of makes sense if, as I'm speaking right now, I seem to be relying actually pretty heavily on the fact that I continue to exist and I continue to care about doing this presentation. It's not that I'm somehow building my identity from one moment to the next. That's exactly what I rely on, right? And I don't worry about 10 seconds from now. I just worry about making sense philosophically, right? And I say, sure. But notice that this might be now a condition that we have acquired, learned, and then we can normally rely on. But this is not something given to us. It actually takes quite a bit for us to establish those conditions under which we can actually rely on our identity over time as the basis for then engaging in these activities. And where this becomes clearer is when we extend now the temporal horizon of these concerns. Because whereas now I can say, I'm pretty confident that not only 10 seconds, but let's say even 10 minutes from now, I'll still be existing, I'll still be caring about talking to the Philosophy Club and making sense of these things. What about 10 months from now? What about 10 years from now? Or 10,000 years, if I can live that long? At that point, it's no longer clear on which basis I can just make that. So it looks like in those cases, I really have to think, okay, what is going to be there 10 months or 10 years from now that if I initiate now a project, let's say now I have this like amazing project of writing about the electronic agency. I want to write a series of volumes about it. And, in principle, it's not different from what I'm doing now. I'm trying to figure out what this is and why doing it for 10 seconds or 10 years should make a difference. Well, it should make a difference because now I can say, I'm not sure now what it means to rely on someone to continue the project 10 years from now, even if it's myself. That's really where the notion of the practical identity, to what extent I can assume that there's going to be a practical identity that is continuous through 10 years time that will continue this project. That's not a given. And so I think that actually that's true all the way to just a few seconds, except that normally now we have been well brought up and we are the kind of beings that actually for the most part, it would actually be problematic if we were going to question our identities over these shorter times. But longer times, it's up for grab. It's actually what we need to reestablish, sometimes in an easy way, but that's really what we do. And so I have this view that as I engage in an activity extended over time, what am I doing with respect to my future selves, right? Whatever I'm supposed to be there. Even if I assume that I exist continuously, so let's assume that I'll be there, the body will be continuous, and I have enough of my psychology to be continuous, whatever is the conditions for my continuity. What I cannot take for granted is the continuity of the practical standpoint. That really, could I take for granted that 10 years from now, I'm still gonna care about diachronic agency? There's nothing in the notion of even the basic identity as continuity that gives me that. Because normally when we think about identity as continuity, this is just basic fun. As long as there's no interruption, you're continuous. I could be constantly changing features. I mean, I'd be constantly transforming. I could be constantly metamorphizing. Every 10 minutes, I'll still be continuous from 10 years from now, right? So from that point of view, whether there is enough stability over 10 years is not something that is given by the nature of identity as continuity. What it seems to me important is what I call identity as identification, meaning, do I identify now with the future self, let's say 10 minutes or 10 years from now, such that we share, me and my future self, 10 minutes, 10 months, or 10 years on the importance of the project of talking about diachronic agency. That's what has to be in place. And what can I rely on? So now at this point, what makes me think that there is stability? If you tell me just my identity, I'm going to tell you no. Just because I'm going to be around, there's no guarantee at all. And we know very well from human lives, you know, whatever, well, maybe you're younger, you don't know. But, you know, stuff that you carry when you were 10 and stuff that you care when you're 50 or when you're 70, you know, if you actually have to make a statement, it's mostly in the novels that people have these continuous unique projects. Real life, a little bit more complicated. So cannot be that identity in that sense. So it looks like what else? Now you can rely on psychological stabilities. Now we might learn that certain people under certain conditions that will be more stable in trait of characters, their interests and their preferences, but philosophically that's accidental. Because okay, maybe people, certain things they care all of their life, other things we don't know. We don't know. There's no, I don't know about diachronic agency. Do people care about philosophy forever? This maybe not. That would just be relying on mere as I said, just mere propensities that we might see and notice. What I suggest is really I need to have more. What I have more is, and since we're getting to 5, I'll do this and then we'll continue. But in my view, I say you offer an invitation to your future self. So in a way, as I'm talking to you now and saying that this is important, I'm also telling myself into the future that there is something to be said for continuing this activity. So somehow implicitly, of course, is an implicit invitation. I think that there is something that will still support it, and maybe I'll do it under the expectation that its importance will be recognized. But there's no guarantee, there's no metaphysical guarantee of that happening. So in a way, as I engage in an activity of this sort, at the same time, I'm also issuing an invitation to my future self to take it up. But what is interesting here, and I think that's the key, is there are 2 modes of offering the invitation. One invitation is that I invite you, me in the future, but also you in the future, as a separate agent. I say, this is important. This is important for everybody. And I've done a little bit of it. I wrote something, take it up later. Maybe it's still interesting. Or maybe everybody should be interested. That's one way to offer the invitation. It's not specific to me. Another one is what we might call an internal invitation. So the invitation is to say, I say to whoever is going to be there into the future, take this on, not simply because this is important or interesting from your point of view, but I'm saying take it on with a shared point of view with me. So the invitation is double. Diachronic agency is interesting, but it's also interesting to you if you want to become me and me becoming you in a way. So I'm offering as part of the invitation that we integrate over time. So the offer of identity is what goes on. Now, in many situations, I expect this to be taken on easily. That's why the invitation that I'm making to myself 10 seconds from now better be relying that it's taken on. I don't even think about it, right? But me 10 years might be a little bit more complicated. I might actually have to write a note to myself in 10 years. I might be important that I keep reminding myself, why is it important to continue with the stuff that Luca was doing 10 years ago? And maybe at the bottom, someone could say, it's not only that the projects were important, but that the projects were necessary to continue being a temporally integrated agent, and I care about that. And accepting the invitation is actually what establishes my identity as temporal identification, simply than as a matter of continuity. Because continuity, our bodies, if I keep being fed, I probably get it, right? So that's the second element, and that is the sense in which I establish an identity, but identity is not guaranteed. It's always an invitation to be taken up later. Anyway, that's kind of like the second part of the project. Once we understand this, I say it's always somehow on this precarious place, if you want, from the metaphysical point of view. Although we might now know how it goes, issue the proper invitation, and rely on the fact that by default get accepted. That's why we don't think about them in many cases. But let's not confuse the reality and maybe the ease with which now we can do that with the fact that the work still has to be done, and these are still achievements, right? And it takes quite a bit to achieve them individually, but also as a society and as a culture, because there's a lot of preconditions that have to be in place for people to be doing philosophy for decades and seeing themselves as an individual personal project. It's not a given. Let's not forget. It takes a lot to create the conditions for that even being possible, and actually possible with relative ease. Anyway, because it's 5, I'll stop here, but I'm happy to continue, take on questions and get into more details. But that should give you a sense of something that has been bothering me for a while, and that I write about.
Yeah, I'll allow myself to sort of interject. It is a little past 5. That is the technical ending.
Right.
Thankfully, Dr. Ferrero has agreed to stay a little bit longer. So feel free, if you guys do have things to do, if you would like to leave, of course, leave at any time. You won't be judged or looked upon or anything like that. If you want to exercise your agency and stay a little bit longer, feel free to do so. We can keep shooting some questions and having some discussions. But for those of you who are going to leave, I appreciate you coming.
Thank you for those we're here until now. So
yeah, Adam will probably still judge you, so just be aware of that.
Why? What's going on? What's going on with that? Adam, why are you still judging me? Oh, now I'm asking the question.
But yeah, if anyone else has questions, feel free to ask them.
Please, yeah. Otherwise,
I do have a question, actually,
sure.
Doctor. I guess it kind of hinged around what you were saying about how a diachronic agent won't be able to have action at a temporal distance.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mean that to be an empirical claim or an essential claim? Does it essentially belong to a diachronic agent that they cannot act at a temporal distance? I was trying to think of like a kind of a thought experiment, and it probably goes well into and maybe beyond science fiction, but let's see how this goes. So I guess, at least theoretically, quantum entanglement could allow action at a distance, right? I have one proton, photon, whatever over here, and then another one over here. What I do to one more or less happens to the other. I don't claim to be an expert in quantum mechanics or even physics, so someone correct me if that's wrong, but I watched a documentary on it in high school, so it's probably valid. I haven't read the Wikipedia article, which is probably the last word on it, but I'll get to that. But so let's just say, for the purposes of kind of a thought experiment, there's quantum entanglement, not over space, but over time, right? So there's proton, photon, whatever, particle A existing right now, and then particle A prime exists 5 seconds in the future, but they're quantumly entangled. So what I do to one happens to the other. Would you say that this is still some kind of mediated agency if I act upon one, act upon the other? Because as far as I could tell, what you were referring to is a temporal mediacy.
Right.
Right. I do something now, and it requires time to pass for its effect to fully work itself out, or I just can't immediately make a decision right now that would actually be that decision in the future. I guess that was more or less your point.
Good. No, that's very good. So let me see. For the purposes of my work, I could initially say, well, this is an empirical statement, there no action at a distance, but something that it turns out for macroscopic beings like us, it's a case. So what you refer to is actually the non-locality that is actually an established fact about quantum mechanics. This is through the Bell's inequality, and it's actually a fascinating and intellectually just like a fascinating things. One of the best accounts, I think, Tim Maudlin as some of the stuff. And actually, I recently just listened to a talk of his that he really explained. It's fascinating because it's just a thought experiment that it was done, and Bell proved that there is some non-locality, and it looks like on conceptual grounds, but having said that, there's two elements to this, just how it affects us. You can say, well, first of all, macroscopically we don't see that. So even if it happened microscopically at that kind of level, it's not within the time scale, for instance, of the things that we could affect ourselves. And second, and on this part, I'm a little bit hesitant because I'm just taking it on the authority of Tim Maudlin, that you happen also to be a teacher of mine at some point. Even if there is no locality, apparently, and this I own his word, that no locality cannot be used to transfer information. So even if it's there, then for the purposes of agency, I take that whatever effects will be affected to transfer information. And if across this no locality, you cannot transfer information, then it wouldn't affect that. But let's set that aside because I cannot speak to that. Well, the second point is, let's assume that there is now, we notice there is no locality, and let's assume that it can be macroscopic, right? But notice exactly what this might happen. If it just means that right now, I could potentially with immediacy affect something in the future, that might just affect one. So maybe that now I make up my mind now, and my making up my mind affects 10 seconds from now. Okay, maybe that happens. But that doesn't mean that then goes on forever. So maybe there could be little jumps, you could say. So through immediacy, you might say, okay, I initiate this. Turns out I don't need to cover the intermediate 10 seconds because that affects there. But that means that past those 10 seconds, you still have the issue about going forward. So if you look at something more temporally extended, the fact that occasionally you can have these, like say, kangaroo jumps, right, in immediacy, doesn't seem to resolve all the issues. It might still say, okay, maybe right now I can do something and that affects 10 seconds from now, but continuing doing my, completing college is not that I'm gonna get it just by this non-locality. It still means that every 10 seconds, I still have to affect 10 seconds farther. And so that is a sense in which it seems to me we might still have a similar problem. For now, and that might be more of now, not an empirical matter, but more a conceptual matter, that even the kind of non-locality they have in mind, it simply means that it allows for jumping over certain gaps, but still not getting the extension. It's not that now the non-locality that I might have allows me somehow to control all of my activities for 10 minutes or for 10 years. That's still left to whatever is going to happen at these other moments. That's how I'm thinking about it, if it makes sense. Now, of course, quantum mechanics is weird, and so we might learn things, but I suspect that, once again, this is just my hunch now. I suspect that if there were a lot of non-locality, and this non-locality gives us extension, and we can actually take advantage of this non-locality in this way, I would suspect that our notion of time and our experience of time would actually be affected, right there. And right now we don't have that. So I'm saying maybe I can make a conceptual claim to the extent that given this non-locality that we experience at the microscopic level and how time is organized for us with this particular topology of time, let's say, that's what it is. If it turns out that time is a completely different topology at the microscopic level, maybe the nature of the problem and what it is to have this diachronic agent, it might change, but I suspect that will go together also with a completely different topology, and I don't know what it will look like. And they might be really different kind of beings. But unless they do everything like that, and it's still there is something as time with its topology, maybe a different one, I suspect that there'll be something matching this. That would be my kind of more conceptual and not empirical claim. I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying.
Yeah, that answers the question.
Yeah.
For more information, feel free to see the Wikipedia page as referenced prior.
Wait till I edit it though.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, another way to see the topology is just like, if you can imagine, I mean, this is with time travel, right? At some point you can have, worms in time space. You can create these kind of holes and go back and so on. I'm saying, look, I don't deny this kind of possibilities, but notice what that means. I'm not sure that although I haven't formulated in this term, it's not that it gives you immediacy about all of these different times. It might, as I said, create a different topology of time that might create interesting complex problems and maybe allow a certain distance of control, but it still would be done, piecemeal. And what interests me is putting all the pieces together ultimately. And that still requires that these other times, something has to be done. That's kind of the generalized claim. It might not action at a distance.
So,
Who's speaking
only
here?
dropped in.
It's like someone's crashing the party.
Sorry.
Transfer
Yeah,
student from Singapore. Is that right?
Yeah. I only dropped in partway, so I'm not sure if maybe you might have addressed it, in which case just let me know. And
Of course I did, Abel. I gave all the answer before you came.
I mean, I'm wondering what kind of conception of a human being, of an agent, right? Because it sounds like we are talking about like time slices here.
Oh, okay.
Is time slice having control over some? I mean, I guess part of it is when we are talking about sort of what the person or the agent or the human being is capable of controlling or doing, right? I mean, here's one way to think of what, sort of an agent is, right? It's fundamentally something that is extended over time in a way that even if, as it were, from a sort of point in time, it seems like there's kind of separation, disconnection, or sort of lack of unity. There's some important sense in which that's not really the case.
Okay, good. So I think this is important here. In my view, I don't want to talk about temporal slices, but I want to talk about temporal selves. Now, and let me see how I draw this distinction. A lot of the talk about temporal slices come from the discussion about the metaphysics about temporal identity or temporal extension for entities not just about persons. And it's an interesting discussion there about the metaphysics. And those time slices might indeed be instantaneous, or there's this whole debate in the mathematics and the nature of the continuous, whether it's discrete or continuous, and how we kind of slice it up and so on. And my concern is that discussion, it turns out, is partly tangential to this other one. And this other one is what I call the moral psychological debate discussion about temporal agency or diachronic agency. Historically, actually, recent history, so what I talk about as temporal selves are not the time slices in the standard discussion of the metaphysics of identity. These are something else. That's why they have some duration. That's why I'm perfectly okay to say that something that exists over the species present with an extended stump are dynamical, they extended over an interval, and they, in some sense, they have some kind of continuity, because that's actually captures what I would like to capture is more that is connected to the phenomenology of our temporal experience. It's not the temporal slice. Now, having said that, it's difficult. It's difficult to give a characterization, but what I want to think that it shouldn't be controversial, that there is something about our experience of temporality and the distinction between what we can do at the present moment and within this, let's call this temporary local surroundings, and what we could do or affect over time. That's really what I'm trying to capture. And I do think, though, I mean, this, in a way, this I make it ultimately as a claim that there is indeed a range of immediacy in what we can control and do. And outside of that immediacy, the indirectness is something that we need to not account for why there is, but why we can at the same time see ourselves as being extended over time as agents and as individual and as subjects, in spite of the fact that there is some indirectness. So to me then now, that's now when I divide myself from others. Others are perfectly fine to say, we are extended. That is kind of a preconditions. And that precondition takes care of all those problems that you raise. You're, in a way, you're kind of generating problems that we wouldn't have when we take it for granted that we are extended beings. And my view is, I said, look, we might be extended as continuous beings. I have no problem with that. But extended that we identify over time, that is an achievement. Although an achievement that once is established can be relied on for a lot of normal conditions. And I'm perfectly fine to grant that. And actually it would be, let's say, pathological if we were not to do it, at least within a more restricted temporal horizon. If I were to question my temporal identification over 10 seconds ranges, that's really problematic once you have enough in there established. But over the longer term, I say, no, that is still something that in a way is up for being established. Then it's okay. Maybe you can implicitly rely on it and so on, but it is in some way an achievement that is ongoing. That's the sense in which I say identification, not just continuity, is something that you have to do. And for me, and I add this stuff also, is because really that crosses the line between what I call the temporal glue. When you're just continuous over time, most of the temporal glue is causal. It's causal glue. When you identify over time, in my view, the glue is normative. So at some point, it's because there are certain way of conceiving of ourselves, certain practices, certain constraints of rationality. When it's all that is built in, that's what keeps us together. And when those are in place and we properly respond to them, I'm saying we can do it with ease. I don't have a problem with that. But notice that all scaffolding and background is the stuff that is in place and keeps us together. And simply saying, oh, we are extended, that just give it for granted and move on. I'm saying no, because you're forgetting that all of this stuff has to be in place. That's would be my view, right? But I know there is a divide here that sometimes is, I would say, is almost of temperament. I am ultimately moved by certain concern that, you know, somehow the existentialism brought about. They concern me. Others are not. So maybe over those, I try to simply remind, can you really take this as granted? Because what the metaphysics can give you is maybe continuity, which I don't have a problem, but there's more. But once again, you know, I might be wrong, you know. Maybe I shouldn't worry about it. I have this debate with others, people that I respect. So maybe I'm the one who's problematic.
Oh no, I mean, there's actually a lot about your view, as I understand it so far, that I like. If anything, I would want to push it further, maybe than you are.
Oh, I see.
To
Okay, now.
No, but I guess so. I guess just to sort of say back at you what I think you were saying. So your concern, in a way, you want to bracket the question of, like, you know, metaphysical continuity and whether that requires any kind of sort of repeated affirmation of your entity, but like this idea that at least insofar as we're concerned about sort of maintaining this kind of phenomenological identification, we have to make sense somehow of various structures and sort of things that sort of need to be in place for this to happen, beyond just the fact that, you know, you are some kind of substance that persists.
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, see, the whole point about talk about substance, let's say, that's you know, if you're not talking about agents, and you talk about the persistence of substances that are not agents, I could say, well, no, maybe I agree. That's the stuff that it can be done. In our metaphysics, well, it's important that there are these entities that they have, have identity over time, and these are the conditions and so on. But for temporal substances now, it looks like that their glue, it's at least causal, it's a certain causal structure together with the, and not just causality, but it's causal in the way that at least supports the persistence of structural features, right? Because of course, you say, look, and that's maybe it's why the continuity of a hip and the continuity of whatever is your preferred account of the substance that is not a human being, you can say, well, there's more. Maybe let's say functional objects, a house, it persists over time because the structural feature can persist over time, and that's important. And I'm not making houses just in time slices of houses that they have to affirm their continued existence in that way. No, that's actually important that we take them as by default. But when I'm thinking about agents like us, I'm saying whatever that account of the substance can give you is still not sufficient. Maybe I can get that at the organism level. So as an animal, I'm a persistent substance, and I grant you that. The kind of agency I'm interested in is something that ends up being built on top of, which also means constrained by and possibly sensitive to the underlying identity of the animal that I am. Absolutely. I mean, it's hard to imagine that I could just like out of nothing and independently that I can lift myself out of the continuous animal that I have and just acquire this practical identity, let's say, that are unrelated and unconnected. That seems to be a leap. So there are some constraints, but it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient. So my concern for diachronic agency as a philosopher outstrips, let's say, whatever my identity as the same self animal give me, and that stuff it still needs to be accounted for. And so if I look at myself 10 years from now and I just want to say, well, but I'm an identical subject, I will say, look, maybe I'm an identical animal. If I'm an identical subject, more has been going on in there and I need to isolate it. Now, of course, remember also here, maybe the specific project about caring about diachronic agency can be subordinated to the fact that I can rely on my identity as the same self subject and not just as a same animal in the future. But if I unpack what it is to be continuous, the same subject there, I would say the structure that I have in mind ultimately will have to come out. That's kind of the idea. So that's why it's always tricky when you think about, you have to look at extreme cases of really what we sometimes call identity crisis, when everything about the practical standpoint come up for question, when you can really that emerges. And those are very rare, and they can be pretty unsettling and upsetting, because for the most part, once we get going, indeed, it's some major pieces might be up for grab, but we still have to do as temporally extended subjects. But I'm still saying, look, that's kind of a Noraf bot situation, because once we have that structure going, we only lose some pieces and we can redo it. But the reality of it, the boat has to be constructed. And that's what we are doing partly by questioning some portion, is to keep the boat going, right? And let's not forget that the boat is there and it's not a given. It's not like just this block. Now, of course, there are other views of this. Any view that thinks that something like the equivalent of the human soul, undivided and simple, would exactly be one view that wouldn't go for this story. We'll say, look, no, that's what it is. Just look, are you the same self subject? Maybe because the soul, the equivalent of it, gives it, and now you have a question, and why you didn't go on with your projects? You're the same agent, and you're committed to them. I cannot believe in that story. And then I'm more worried about, what we replace the soul with. That's, if you want, put into the context of this, way of thinking. Which does, sorry, but I'll let other people otherwise have a comment on this later, but I don't want to prevent others from saying something. I'll scroll through.
I'll say something. So
okay, who's speaking? Sorry, I don't see this. Oh, Omar. Okay,
Omar.
Good.
So I guess I'll just go through what I think you've been saying from my perspective. So we have a problem that is inherent in the fact that we are temporal agents. And that problem is that whatever actions we are taking right now are not guaranteed to make the impacts in the future that we want. And that's because of two different things. One of them is that we can't guarantee ourselves continuing our efforts, and the other is that we can't guarantee other agents will continue our efforts. So we solve the first problem of ourselves by establishing an identity, and we do that psychologically. We have an ego that creates the subject object, and then we create a narrative around that. And that narrative, we hope, is something that we will keep carrying throughout our lives, and hopefully it'll keep us on the path that we were hoping to stay on in the moment. But I'm not sure if you said anything about the second part, which is that we're unsure about the actions of other agents in the future. And I think I think that is an essential function of culture. It's to guarantee that our sacrifices and our actions as agents in the moment will lead to what we want in the future. And we subordinate ourselves to culture for that very reason, because we can't guarantee that even if we have an identity, we might be able to guarantee to some degree our own actions. We need a culture, and we need to subordinate ourselves to it to guarantee that other agents act in accordance with what we want. Am I getting that right?
You're getting it right, and it's fantastic. I want to make one correction and then try to answer to give you a sense of how we might go with the second. The correction for the first part, you just said that I hope about my future. I want to say there is more than hope, in the sense that when I set out to do this these actions extended over time, they go together. I'm making an invitation. So in a sense, I'm not simply hoping that it's taken up. I mean, I'm worried. I mean, metaphysically, there is a threat, but I have more than a hope, because I'm trying to do something now so that I make it indeed inviting. In issuing the invitation, I'm addressing with thinking that actually there'll be good reason to be taking it up. And part of the reasons are that in taking it up, you're not simply taking up the activity, but you're taking up the identity as well. So the offer that I make is, let's say, to the animal that I expect to be there in 10 years from now, because I expect that I'll be feeding somehow, or someone will feed me, is that I say, look, there's also this thing. It's not simply that this stuff is cool and interesting, but it's also Luca continuing to be it. And then by default, that's how the kind of invitation goes, right? So it's a package. I say, hey, Luca, here's the stuff to do. And you say, well, who are you addressing it to? In a way, that's kind of like what it gets tricky here, because it seems to be paradoxical. I'm addressing it to myself, but am I pre-existing? So I'm already Luca and I'm accepting it. Then he says, look, then it doesn't mean. And I'm saying, no, I'm kind of addressing it in a way that in accepting the invitation, I continue to make myself to be the same. That's kind of the way that you have to conceive of it.
I would also introduce the idea that it's not only an invitation to your future self, it's also a threat, because observing yourself doing things that violate your own sense of identity is a major cause of negative emotion and issues.
Okay, good. That's right. So there's a threat on both sides, right? I am threatened now by the fact that I don't have this immediate control, right? Even, quantum non-locality or something, I don't know. So in a way, when I issue the invitation, if you want, it's like I'm coming, and I say, do whatever you want, but if you don't do it, you'll be at a loss. You won't know, that you're supposed to be receiving the invitation. You don't know who you're gonna be. You'll be totally, as I say, lacking a sense of who you are, your location, and so on. So that's partly what is at stake. Now, if you have an alternative, you could have a better things to do, then I don't know. But it turns out that usually that's the only things on offer. It's not that all of a sudden, because if I reject completely the invitation that is coming, what is left for me to go on? No, well, okay, I'm the animal that I am, and now I completely reject this. That's why it's true that it also comes with a potential price. I'm saying, if you want to go on your own, do, but tell me what else there is to do. Now, of course, it's a little bit more complicated because I can accept a part and reject others, and that's good because the dynamics is not that everything that comes from the past should be accepted. But let's see now what happens with a group of people. And you mentioned culture. I think you're onto something. In a way, if you're thinking about human beings living together and thinking about the future, in many ways, I would expect that there's a lot of projects that we are setting up and that we are offering to the other futures travelers, let's call them, are indeed in this form. I'm saying, look, here's some things that I have been doing. I've been doing philosophy. And to a future philosopher, I'm not simply offering you, oh, here's a cool project you can go on of doing philosophy. I'm also offering you at the same time in inviting you to be part of this larger project, which is sustaining the continued existence of the practice of philosophy. And I do that in part by inviting you to join me in a shared practical standpoint that now is no longer the standpoint of Luca, is the standpoint of the doing of philosophy. And a lot, so now cultures in part, I would say, play this kind of role. So there might be a lot of elements that we identify as a culture that actually are as offering the continuity of extended projects as projects in which we identify with. But not all parts of cultures are like that, because some other parts of culture, they only provide precondition or somewhat stable conditions under which we'll continue to do things as a matter of a habit. So no one is to think, oh, it's not that I really care about this and so on. This has been done for a while. It's an easier way, almost inertially, and that's part of my culture. So in that case, there's no offer of identity. It's just, there are some grooves, let's say, they make it easier, and we can explain them, and some aspects of culture work that way. But other parts are very different. It's like really establishing. And notice, these are not fixed identities necessarily or something, but it's the idea that we come together thinking, actually, this is an invitation to continue on some path that makes sense, seen as an extended path, not simply like, oh, I got stuck, here's what comes from my ancestors, okay, now they constrained, okay, then they force me to go in certain directions rather than another. It looks you see how it looks different from, oh, I take in this on. Of course, I'm also constrained because it's not that I start from scratch, but I actually think the constraint that they set up are good constraints because it's really the one that provide the condition for continuing this. And if I can add this, actually, philosophically, a lot of the discussion that we see now regarding the appointment for the Supreme Court, right? It's actually, this is one of the things, how you think about the Constitution of the United States. In a way, I want to say Constitution are exactly a kind of document that made explicit the fact that we want to have identities that we share across generations. And it is a case in which is made explicit. So here's the practical identity, and here's the idea that if we join into it, we're going to sustain it. And we explicitly somehow, these are exactly how they make it explicit. But now it means what it means to be true to the continuity of that project. And so the debate between originalist or whatever it is exactly a project like what it means to take on this kind of identity. Now, my view personally is like, it's a crazy view, the one that thinks that this is all fixed. That if you properly interpret what it is, it's supposed to be something that is supposed to preserve identity over time. So something has to be stable there, but the stability is the understanding I lay out what are the basic features that are subjected to interpretation and agreement as we move along in such a way as to preserve continuity. But we cannot on out an originalist position to the extent the originalists say, well, I'm with you. I'm totally with you on the fact that we are continuing this, but I have such a rigid understanding of what the invitation was. So what the founding fathers or whatever, what is the invitation that they issue to us? And there's different ways of interpreting what the invitation is like. But it's also third option. Someone says, the invitation is over now. We should start from scratch, revolutionary moments, or as it happens, at some point you establish a new constitution, or something intermediate, like you can write amendments and try them. It means, okay, the project was okay up to now, but really we need to kind of get into another place. It's another gear, shift the gear, and some of it is a break, and some of it is a loss, but we can live with that. That's the nature of diachronic projects. So in that way, I'm saying there is a whole spectrum from a culture all the way to a constitution, and to our understanding of the debate isn't the same model. Actually made more explicit in that way that is normally for us, right? but it would have the same structure. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh no, thanks to you. That was great. Fantastic. Yeah.
Yes. So
Sorry. I don't know if I see some people in the chat, but I might not. Oh no, there was some. Jason said aye, and he might have left then. Okay, sorry.
yeah. So just for sake of time, I will sort of cut us off as of right now, just because I am recording this. What I'm going to do is put this recording on our philosophy website. And so if you have people who maybe wanted to come and join in the discussion but weren't able to, they're dead to me. No, I'm just kidding. But I will be trying to post this. On top of that, I made a Discord if you guys want to continue any conversations or anything like that, and you have Discord. It's very new, so it's not fully set up yet, but that's another sort of avenue if you guys sort of want to continue this conversation. But other than that, I really appreciate all you guys coming. Dr. Ferrero, I really appreciate your time and you talking to us and things like that. Sorry I had to sort of cut us off eventually. I would love to talk forever.
No. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to everybody. It's been fantastic. And now you'll see the transcription on the video. If you put them, you won't be able to make any sense. But we'll say it's the algorithm. It's bad, not me.
Okay. But anyways, thank you guys so much. Have a good rest of your night. Next Wednesday, we don't have a meeting, but the following one we will. I'll send out emails to remind everyone as well. Dr. Avery Snelson will be talking, a recent PhD graduate student, so that's going to be very nice. Don't know what he's going to be talking on, probably Nietzsche or something that he enjoys. So again, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ferrero.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ferrero.